Welcome to the Truth Nation podcast. Bill Bodner here with the chief, Mark Garrett. Mark, a lot going on lately. Here we are, in the middle of February. Oof, a lot going on in government right now.
A ton. And hey, I want to be totally transparent. We are actually searching while we're recording right now, Bill, because the stuff that you sent me over the last couple of days is just like an out of control vine. There's no end to it. Yeah. And I'm going to let you take it from there, but it's crazy.
That's a great way to describe it. So what we're going to talk about today is what's been going on with USAID, a little bit about Samantha Powers, the person who was formerly now in charge of USAID. And what's interesting is, man, they have, I don't know who's done it, if it's, the State Department under Rubio now, they pretty much wiped her name off of everything. And if you do a search right now, who's running USAID, it says Marco Rubio. Mm-hmm. So I guess she's officially gone. But we're going to talk about USAID, how the government funds, quote, their policy initiatives, unquote, around the world. We're going to talk about something called a 278E. It's a federal form. It's something that I had to fill out my last 7 years working for the Department of Justice, a financial disclosure form. And we're going to kind of show people how to dig into that. And we're going to dig into a couple things and find, I don't know if it's conflicts of interest, but things that for sure I know that that would not have been approved for me to do. And we'll talk about specific things that in my career where I had opportunities to do things that I couldn't do because of a perceived conflict of interest, or it just didn't look good. Something that was, quote, didn't really look good. USAID, Mark, something that it's a government agency, something that was started in, I think, 1961 by JFK. And I think to understand what that agency was at the time and why it was I don't know if envisioned or why it was established. And tell me if you think this is not accurate, but this was a Cold War time in our history, right? And I think that's very telling. I think JFK and the U.S. government wanted an efficient way to counter Soviet influence abroad. And through foreign assistance, right? Through a way to fund things that would counter Soviet influence abroad. And I think from the reporting I read, JFK thought that the State Department, like most of government, was just incredibly bureaucratic, and it was a struggle to maybe get things done. So they thought, well, we'll just create this new agency as a way to be able to fund some of these things that are, quote, in the best interest of the United States, and that might counter the influence peddling that the Soviet Union was trying to do. Is that something that's in line with how you see the origin of this government entity, Mark, USAID?
I do. And as you summed it up there at the very end, Bill, this is what the Soviets were engaged in as well, that they were influencing really political action, social action in this country as well, and really did until the end of the Cold War. So this was really a tit-for-tat strategy that JFK and the federal government were engaging in, and that was the origin, really to combat the Soviets at a grassroots level.
Right. It's interesting, and we'll get into it later, is to what extent our tax money should be used to fund things that aren't really essential services in this country. And that's a very broad question, Mark. Probably be a little challenging to even stay focused going through this because there's just so much information out there. So the Congress passed the Foreign Assistance Act in 1961. Kennedy set up the agency. And I think the way I would term it, Mark, a propaganda agency, right? It was a battle. It was something that was used to win the hearts and minds. That's an old term that probably remember from the Cold War time. And it tried to use money and aid programs, to influence other countries around the world and further U.S. policies or things that would be beneficial to the U.S.
And to confirm, Bill, the actual agency, USAID, was created through an executive order, not through legislation. The legislation was there for the funding part of it, but the creation of this agency was an executive order.
So that's interesting, right there. And with it being shut down now, Mark, or I don't know I don't even know what is the status of it currently. I guess
Well, right now it's certainly been curtailed, notwithstanding the involvement in what I consider these rogue federal judges that have put a lot of things on hold, not just with USAID, with some other things that Doge is involved in. But that status, the second part of that is what's left of USAID has been rolled into the State Department under Secretary Rubio.
I think that's a great point you just brought up there, Mark, which I kind of skipped over, is that all this came to light through the Department of Government Efficiency, right? Through Doge. It was probably absent that. I don't know if, the public still wouldn't know about a lot of these programs, a lot of these things going on, and how money funnels to all these places around the world. I want to start with just a quick thing to kind of show the absurdity of some of the funding, right? And I don't want to get hung up on, every single thing, that dissecting every single place where money goes and giving our opinion on it. But this, I feel, is especially interesting because there's court paperwork, right? When there's court paperwork, there's more than smoke, there's fire. So what kind of motivated me to look at this is I saw a statement from Senator Chris Murphy, I don't know, a week or so ago, and it said, and this is regarding the shutdown of USAID. It said the immediate consequences of this are cataclysmic. Anti-terrorism programs will shut down and our most deadly enemies will get stronger, right? That's what this senator said.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of the billions of tax dollars spent by the U.S. Agency for International Development that are being questioned now, millions of dollars, Mark, went to fund terrorism. And that's not my opinion. I'm going to now tell you the court cases that have been filed against charities and individuals who funneled money to terrorist groups. So it just shows the absurdity of a senator saying that shutting this down is actually going to hurt our fight against terrorism, when the reality is some of this money was going to fund terrorism. A multi-year investigation brought by the Justice Department and U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia reveals the scope of how funds were used in one recent terrorism-related case. The case represents one of the most significant diversions of USAID-funded humanitarian aid that USAID OIG, that's Office of Inspector General, has investigated. It involves a Syrian national, Mahmoud al-Hafian, who was charged with illegal diverting more than $9 million of taxpayer money through USAID to armed combatant groups, including the Al-Nusra Front, ANF, a designated foreign terrorist organization affiliated with Al-Qaeda in Iraq. According to the indictment, he ran an NGO, a non-governmental organization, and we got to get into that, Mark, and talk about what those are and how the U.S. government uses those to kind of fund these things. And he managed 160 employees. Since Syria's civil war began in 2011 and through 2020, obviously we're in a different place today in 2025, right? U.S. taxpayers funded more than $12 billion of U.S. aid money to Syria, intended for food and medical supplies, that was supposed to be administered by the United Nations agencies and NGO. The NGO that this gentleman led received $122 million over 3 years. He diverted food kits meant for refugees to the actual terrorist commanders, according to the complaint. And this is an FBI counterterrorism case, right? This is the FBI and USAID OIG that investigated this. Some other examples of criminal cases regarding USAID funds. A former executive of digital consulting firm in Delaware agreed to pay $100,000 settlement to resolve allegations that he knowingly caused company employees to submit false claims to USAID in order to receive government contracts. It goes on, and we can get into some of these things, but how strange is it? How crazy is it that the U.S. government or USAID actually funded some operations that where the money ended up going to terrorist groups, and there's criminal cases to kind of prove that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I say strange is certainly one word. I would say it's look. You know me, the listeners know me. I've always been an advocate for the leanest, smallest government possible. Not no government, but the leanest government possible. And the reason is because government operations are made up of individual people, and individual people are flawed. Everybody is. And so when you start having these complex, these detached agencies like USAID, bad things are going to happen. When you don't have oversight, Bill, people are going to start engaging in a couple of things. They're going to start engaging in personal goals. In other words, their pet peeves, the things that they want to achieve that they think are important. And number two, they're going to start engaging in corrupt behavior. That is just human nature without oversight and without people who have incredibly strong character, otherwise without other oversight. So am I shocked by what we're finding out now? I am terribly shocked, but I'm not surprised.
A good way to put it. NGOs, Mark, NGOs, non-government organizations, how do you, just in general terms, before we kind of get a little in the weeds with it, how do you feel about the government relying on them so heavily? Like, we'll hear about billions of dollars of aid going to Ukraine or wherever it's going to, and I don't know that the American people realize how that aid money is spent, that it's going to these kind of beltway bureaucratic organizations, and from there there's just layers of administrative fees stripped off of it, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think about that whole premise of the U.S. government using NGOs now, so relying on them so heavily to do all this foreign policy stuff?
Well, listen, I am a believer in public-private partnerships to some degree, especially at local, maybe state levels. The problem is when you get to the federal government, when you're looking at, I think we have about 2 million government federal employees. When you look at these agencies, the leaders of whom, the directors of whom, the management of whom say that they don't have any accountability to Congress, that they don't have any oversight responsibility, you can't see our books. I mean, these are things that we're literally being told right now. When you don't have the accountability, when you don't have the oversight, things like this happen. So again, this is why I am in favor of the smallest possible government, just out of the necessities as articulated in the Constitution. But the more and more layers that you pile on, by the way, this is true in the private sector as well, Bill. The more and more layers you pile on, the more committees you have, the more think tanks you have, then the less the accountability and the further the separation from the taxpayer to the end product, quote unquote. So I am not a fan of NGOs because they are rife with abuse and fraud and illegality. Not always, but it's a huge possibility. And we're seeing this. The other thing I want to talk about with NGOs, Bill, and you hit on this a little bit, look, for lack of a better phrase, we're seeing the complexity here now with the revelations coming out of USAID. For lack of a better phrase, it's money laundering. It's money laundering because you have one GO working with another charity, and this money passes hands. You lay this out about the different layers here. But not only layers within one organization, it's going from one organization to another. And so the ability to track the taxpayer money is almost impossible. And so that's what we're seeing here. So I'm not a fan of it. And I think that what we're seeing now explains why.
Mark, I'm glad you brought up that money laundering thing, because I did want to touch on that, and I actually forgot as I'm sitting here this morning. There's different stages in money laundering, right? And I know this from my time at DEA doing money laundering investigations. The first one is placement, the actual funds getting placed into the system. The next step is called layering. And that's when you kind of try to obscure the source of the funding by mixing it around and having it go a bunch of different directions. And with these NGOs, to be honest, that's what I see. And maybe we'll pull up an example or two later on. There's a couple big NGOs that seem to really fund everything. The money goes to them first, then it goes to another organization, then it goes to another organization. And as you said, the money just gets filtered all over the place, and it becomes very confusing and so much overhead. So in the U.S., I think there was a total of $72 billion of foreign aid last year, right? That was provided, and that is 42% of all the aid that's tracked worldwide. So the U.S. accounts for 42% of all the world's aid. 40 billion of that comes from USAID, and that's a lot of money. So what are the top NGOs? The Catholic Relief Services is the top one. 4.6 billion went to a nonprofit called Catholic Relief Services. Should the government be with separation of church and state, with taxpayer money being used to do this, should taxpayer money be going to a Catholic relief service? Should it be the number one, relief agency in the world, or should it be the number one NGO as far as funding?
Bill, it's a great question, and I hadn't thought about this until you posed it. Isn't it ironic that really the same kind of element that really markets the separation of church and state mantra over and over and over and over, a lot of these same bureaucrats and elected officials are now, we find out, that are engaged to this extent with a Catholic charity, and they don't mind mixing the money now with religion. They don't mind mixing the government with religion when it serves their purposes. By the way, on a little editorial note here, I just got to put this out here about the separation of church and state. I know this is a little bit of a sideline, but I think it's important. Separation of church and state, the whole thing, it's not in the Constitution, it's not in the Declaration, it doesn't exist. It's all a fallacy about this. This was a letter that was written by Thomas Jefferson to a church, and in short, it was not about keeping religion out of government. It was about keeping government out of religion. In other words, that's the First Amendment, the freedom to practice religion. So it wasn't about keeping government out of religion. It was simply not establishing a national religion. But the point is that when purposes are served certain people, they're okay mixing the two.
What else is interesting here, Mark, is I see some of these NGOs, and I had experience with companies like this when I worked for the government. And the company's specialty is whatever the government's buying. And I know that sounds a little strange, but I look at a company like Chemonics International. This is they receive 4.5 billion in USAID. They are a for-profit company, right? It's not a nonprofit company. Mm-hmm. They're a company that a going concern trying to make money, and basically whatever type of contract the government is putting out. And I don't blame them for doing this, right? There's nothing illegal about doing this. They put together a team and try to and bid on the contract, and they become almost, like I said, where whatever the government's selling, they're going to buy it. And this is that the most efficient way to do things? No, I don't think so. I remember, I just using the Pentagon for an example. I remember being on the board to review contracts once, and I want to say it was about a $5 million contract. And it was going to be over a number of years. So not $5 million a year, but the total value was going to be about $5 million. And the way the bids were looked at is, first, you looked at just the technical capabilities of the companies. There was no pricing information included. And our job was to rank them based on that. And as part of that, as part of the technical capabilities, you saw, or the company disclosed who their officers were, like who was going to work on this contract. And I remember there was one particular company that it was all former military generals, right? And one of the guys I was doing the contract with, he said, "Oh, this is going to be the most expensive vendor." And I said, "What? Why do you say that? Like, we don't even know." He goes, "No, look at look at the people here. They're former DOD employees. They're used to just spending money and, not really having any limits." And sure enough, when we ended up getting the pricing information, they were like 50% higher than all the other companies, just because that was their experience when they worked at DOD, is contracts were fat. And the way these contracts are awarded, I don't know, Mark. I think something has to change, because who is determining the policy priorities, or who's determining like what gets awarded to where?
Well, Bill, that's a great question. The answer is we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, I mean, it's almost to the point of taxation without representation. I know it's a little bit of a stretch here, but it's certainly taxation without accountability. I think that's more accurate. We don't know how these contracts are being, by the way, these contracts, grants, federal aid, initiatives, we don't know who's making the decision about where this money goes.
Yeah. Yeah. Where do you want to go next, Mark? What do you got?
Well, I think there's so much, and the things that you sent me and things that I've been looking at as well. I said one thing leads to three things, and so forth and so on. But going back to the NGOs, as compared to where we are now, as compared to 1961, we opened the show about the origin of USAID. In other words, whether it was the elected officials or bureaucrats or the president in 1961, I don't think anybody would have imagined that, in other words, this agency would be funding, climate change initiatives and the look. Some of this money went to actually importing some of the illegal immigrants that were flowing in during the previous administration. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars to bring people into the country who are not legally allowed to be here. And so the idea of, the original intent of the agency has no bearing to what we're seeing now. So, where you want to go, it's all over the place. I mean, in other words, the possibilities are endless. But this is the whole quote unquote bloated government. And I say quote unquote because we've heard that term from every administration, from both of the major political parties for all of my lifetime, at least going back to Ronald Reagan that I can remember, and not a damn thing's been done about it. And so now we're seeing some effort here to say, wait a minute, number one, we have to have transparency, real transparency. And number two, we don't need X amount of percentage of this stuff. We don't need as many employees, and we certainly don't need to be sending money to these completely inappropriate places and organizations. So I'll let you continue from there, but that's just for me to set the stage from my point of view.
Yeah, I think, and also like a lot of the money seems to kind of contradict, or it's almost like sometimes we're funding both sides of an issue with our aid money. And here's an example, and this is from the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, right? His words: one of the most egregious examples of USAID mismanagement is its role in Afghanistan's opium trade. The agency spent hundreds of millions of dollars on irrigation canals, farming equipment, and fertilizer, which supported unprecedented poppy cultivation and heroin production, ultimately benefiting the Taliban, right? And at this same time that this was going on, my agency ramped up, opened offices over there to basically attack the Taliban opium trade. And was a huge Department of Justice presence over there, a huge Department of Defense presence over there. And the question becomes is like I said, we're funding both sides of an issue, and who is ultimately responsible for that, and who's not aware of that?
Yeah, and Bill, there's another point you've made. I wasn't aware of that specific that particular example, but the inefficiency, and that isn't in Doge. It's Department of Government Efficiency. Does that sound efficient to anybody? That we be funding both sides of the fence in that topic? Of course not. It's very interesting. When I'm watching the discussions, Bill, about the president's ability to see the books, who's appointed to do the work, things like this, and I see the pushback. And my question is there's a huge red flag. Why would anybody be opposed to simply peeling back the onion and seeing what's going on? Where would the opposition to that be? Now, again, you can say, oh no, okay, we see what's going on. You can't cut that. We need that. You can make the argument all day long. That's fine. I can still call you wrong. You can call me wrong. But we can't even have a real discussion until we actually see what the dollars are, where they're going, why, and to what end. We can't have a real discussion as taxpayers or government officials or any other stakeholders until we see that. So I don't know why. Well, I have my ideas why people are pushed back, and I think you're going to get into that here in a little bit. But I think the fact that certain people, certain elected officials and bureaucrats and unions are pushing back so hard is an indication of why they don't want the books to be open.
Yeah. And I want to almost say, Mark, that we've heard for 10 years now about this term, the swamp, right? And kind of associated terms, I don't know, deep state or whatever. I don't even know really what that's supposed to mean. But here's what I do know is now when you look at this and you see, like in the past, we've seen certain politicians and government employees become incredibly wealthy during their tenure at the government. And at least I wonder, because, I was pretty much at the highest level of federal government as far as pay. I didn't, I thought I invested pretty good, Mark, but I definitely didn't walk away the way some of these people did. And it makes you wonder, like, is this what that is? Has someone finally pulled back the curtain to take a look at this? And is it somehow weaved in with charitable organizations and speaking engagements and consulting fees that are charged, and kind of this roundabout where the money goes around and round and everyone takes a piece, and then what's left at the end goes to the intended recipient, and like you said, almost money laundering, right? One thing that I heard, and I got to touch on this, because hey, there's as much as there's things that come out that need to be addressed, there's also things that come out where they're not necessarily accurate, or they need to be fact checked, or they're allegations that aren't new. And one of the things, Mark, I don't know if you saw it, was about the Clinton Foundation.
Yes.
And Chelsea Clinton, right?
Yes.
So the allegation was that Chelsea Clinton got $84 million, and that $3 million of it was used to pay for her wedding. And then, I even saw things that were very kind of bold, proclaiming like, this is true, or Doge proved this. And so here's where that comes from. And I'll break it down in two different spots. The first is the $3 million for the wedding. That's not a new claim, Mark. That claim comes from 2016. And I don't know if you were aware of the WikiLeaks back then, emails from Podesta to someone in the Clinton inner circle. And one of the emails that came out was this person in the Clinton inner circle complaining about Chelsea Clinton spending foundation money on her wedding. So that allegation has been around forever. That's not new. It's nothing in Doge to really substantiate that. who knows? In my world, who knows about that? And then there was this idea that $84 million went to Chelsea Clinton. And again, and then, all these fact checkers come out and say, that's not true. And other people
Right.
say it is true. And here's what the reality is. It's not true, but it also is true to some extent, because if you trace the money, and we can actually go through and do an exercise here, Mark, if you want.
Sure.
Anthony, if you want to open up
Yeah.
Data Republican or whatever that site is called, we can kind of show, no, not that one. There should be the website. If you can just go to a website, www. Data Republican, I think it's called.
Yeah, and I have it open as.
Yeah, and we can do some fishing and kind of explain what people are looking at, and kind of show the nature of the layering of this money and how confusing it is.
Yes.
Okay, so go up to federal grant search on the left, on the left margin. There's federal grant search, and then in keywords type Chelsea Clinton. Or no, you know what? Go to principal officer search. Let's do that first. So the one above that, and then in the just delete that William Crystal. I have no idea who that is.
Well, by the way, that's it. It's like a default. It popped up for me too every time.
Okay, and so in where it says William, no, in the next box over where it says officer, put Chelsea Clinton. And we're going to see, let's see, I think 5. Let's count them. School of American Ballet, the Museum for African Art, Clinton Health Access Initiative, Bill and Hillary Clinton Foundation, and Grace Science. Now here's the thing, Mark. There could be more than one person named Chelsea Clinton in the great United States, right? So we don't know if all these are the same person even. But here's what we do know. The Bill, Hillary, and Chelsea Clinton Foundation, I'm pretty confident that's the Clinton family as we know it. So over on the right, Anthony, you'll see USAID grant flow. And if you click that, this is, and I guess scroll down, and this is kind of what we're seeing there. And I know that's real hard to see. If you can blow it up and find, I think it'll probably be on the far right, where we actually see the Clinton Foundation somewhere, maybe at the bottom, or it's either on the far right or the far left. Now, so let's check on the other side. It kind of shows the flow of all these different it's hard to kind of see. This isn't really.
Let me see. I have it open as well, if I remember correctly. Here we go. Let's see.
Okay, right there. Is this it right here? What is this? What is this? Yeah, there you go. Is that Bill, Hillary, and Chelsea Clinton Foundation? So this kind of shows where they are. Now, you've heard people say that they received 84 million of USAID money. Well, the gross receipts right there on the top line, 83.6. So that's technically 84 million of gross receipts in that foundation. 23 million from contributions. Now, taxpayer funds, and I guess that's directly $17,500, right? But now if you zoom out, you can see kind of this web of some of these, the ones that are red, by the way, have a high amount of, like, that's a great, World Vision Incorporated, $661 million of taxpayer money went to World Vision Incorporated. I have no idea what that is, right? But as you can see, that money gets filtered around from one NGO or nonprofit to another. And again, another $257 million of taxpayer money in the Institute of International Education. And eventually, some of this money finds its way to the Bill and Hillary Clinton Foundation. It's a web, right? It's a crazy.
And by the way, Bill, apologies for the interruption. I looked up some of these organizations. World Resources Institute, East West Management Institute. Now, by the way, the high taxpayer fund alerts you're talking about a minute ago. and trying to follow that web, not only back to the Bill and Hillary Foundation, but to other ones as well. The Tides Center, that's a big one. And it's, if people are looking at this, on our screen right now, or they went to on their own or looking at it, if you think it's complicated, it's complex and hard to follow, you're absolutely right. And this is what we're talking about when we use the term money laundering. Maybe, maybe sleight of hand, money diversion, any number of terms you might want to use. But when you look at the complexity of this, it should send off alarm bells to anybody being intellectually honest that this is difficult to follow. And the question is why?
Right. Right. And I think to kind of simplify it a little bit, there's different ways I can get money to you, Mark. We have two producers, Anthony and Vince. I can give $20,000 to Anthony, and he gives $15,000 to Vince, and Vince gives $10,000 to you, and I've never given you a dime, Mark.
Right.
Right. And to some extent, like, I have to think that's what's going on here. And a lot of this money is taxpayer money. So when you heard about Chelsea Clinton getting $84 million, the reality is the Bill and Hillary and Chelsea Clinton Foundation, their gross receipts were $83.6 million. How much of that, here's a question I have for you, Mark, and I don't know the answer to this, and I don't know if you do, or Anthony or Vince. When you see that one and you see $17,500 in taxpayer funds, does that mean direct from the government, or does it get tracked through all these? Is it segregated in each of these different charitable foundations and NGOs? Is it segregated so that they can track it the whole way? Because I would have to think it's not.
Well, Bill, I'm glad you asked the question, because I was looking at this stuff for a couple of hours today, and I was trying to figure out the same thing. And I don't have the answer now. It's all of them. It's highlighted in red when you get the taxpayer funds. So I'm imagining there's some level of separation, legally or administratively, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure about it. It's one more level of confusion for me.
Right. And it's interesting that, when you look at what some of these organizations are, or what they're doing, and I guess, anything else on this part, Mark, looking through?
Well, not specifically, but I'll say this. I mean, I think the complexity speaks for itself. The confusion speaks for itself. The second thing I want to say about this bill is again, I know that nobody is required to respond to allegations publicly or any other way if they don't feel they need to. And so I'm not holding anybody to that standard, that requirement. I'm not. However, there are things that if they were said about me, oh, well, Mark Garrett took $10,000 from his charity to pay for a vacation. It would take me about 2 seconds to say, no, look, here are my credit card receipts. Here is my transfer from my ATM, whatever it is. No. I paid for everything. In other words, there would be no reason for me not to, on a personal level. And if you are a supporter of USAID, I would imagine, like the Clintons are, and I'm guessing, from a operational point of view, from a philosophical point of view, you would want to defend the organization. You want to defend that system, that agency. And you also want to defend yourself. So it would be very, very easy to go ahead and provide some redacted documents. Say, oh no, this came out of my account, or my parents' account, or my husband's account, or whatever it is, or our friends paid for the wedding, any number of ways. The silence, to me, it doesn't mean anything for sure, but it's intriguing that this allegation's been around, like you said, Bill, now for 9 years, and we've never heard anything from the contrary that will lead us to believe it's not accurate. It may not be, but we don't have anything to lead us in another direction.
Right. Anthony, can you bring up that? So here's another thing that and I'll kind of show how there is let me put it like this, how there is the potential for abuse, right? So federal government employees at a high level have to fill out something called a Form 278. And it's a financial disclosure form. I had to fill one out for the last 7 years I was in government. It's a pain in the neck. And you have to show show all the types of property you own, interest in businesses, where you're generating income from, etc. So Anthony now has put up on the screen the 278 from 2024, I think, for Miss Powers, who used to run USAID, right? So yeah, Samantha Powers, there it is, page 11. And you look down, and this is just one thing I found this morning, right? You see that thing that Anthony has highlighted there, Boston Consulting Group. And it's a consulting fees of $80,000. So when I read these reports, there's always a couple things I'm skeptical of. One is, I don't want to say skeptical, I'm interested in researching. One is consulting fees because it's very vague, right?
Yes.
And the other is honorariums for speaking, because you can pay someone any amount of money to show up and talk, and it's very difficult to say that it's not appropriate. So we see that she disclosed that she got $80,000 from Boston Consulting Group for, quote, consulting fees. Now, if you go back to Data Republican, Anthony, that website, and let's do a federal grant search and then in there type Boston Consulting Group. And let's see if anything comes up. It's taking some time here.
Yeah, it's slow sometimes.
Metropolitan Family Services. Now hit read more where it's given in the description. Mm-hmm. Now just read the beginning of this. Metropolitan Family Services, through the Metropolitan Peace Initiative, is requesting $2 million over 36 months to expand the delivery of community-based violence intervention and prevention services throughout the city of Chicago, et cetera, et cetera. And if you look down, or can you do a Control F, Anthony, and just type in the word Boston? Yeah, there we go. In collaboration with Boston Consulting Group to understand the human capital needs of blah, blah, blah. So the head of USAID took $80,000 consulting fee from Boston Consulting Group, and here's a contract for $2 million that was awarded to Metropolitan Family Services, but it's obviously have established advisory committee in collaboration with the Boston Consulting Group. So it's just dirty. It's a little dirty. Like, we shouldn't have. Thanks, Anthony, for opening that up. Yeah. We shouldn't have. You shouldn't see that type of thing in government like that. And just so people know, that's where the potential for abuse comes, is through honorariums, consulting fees. This money goes round and round. Everybody takes a cut. The head of USAID also taking a $470,000 salary from Harvard while working as the head of USAID, and Harvard involved in a ton of grants that were issued.
A ton of federal grants.
Mark, this is something that I feel like you'll have something to say about. The recent discoveries about USAID going to certain media outlets and publications. Mm-hmm. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's rotten.
Yeah.
I think it's rotten to the core. And it's funny, Bill, because we look at, like you said, the fact checkers are saying, "Oh, this is not true," blah, blah. I want people to remember, the history of fact checkers who've only been around for, a handful of years, so to speak, in the culture. But remember, a lot of these publications, I'm not talking about the ones that USAID is paying for, but I'm talking about the publications with the fact checkers, right? These same publications fact-checked the Hunter Biden laptop.
Yep.
They fact-checked the how about crossfire with the current president about his dealings with Russia before he was in the White House, on and on and on and on. And they fact check, "Oh, this is not true. This is not true. This is not true." this is false, 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 and they have the big, false conclusion, false, false. So now we have the same fact checkers that are telling us that the concerns that we have or allegations that are being made are inaccurate. To me, Bill, they have more than lost their credibility to be quote unquote fact checkers. They are a propagandist. But going back specifically to funding these certain publications, it looks like, and we won't use the name, but it looks like this one publication that starts with a P that USAID has funded. It looks like the federal government, the taxpayers through USAID, has literally kept this publication financially alive on life support. And in exchange, there's no doubt that this publication has been doing certain marketing on behalf of not only USAID, but other government entities that are favorable, in my opinion. So yeah, dirty is the right word. Corrupt is a stronger word. And these are, the lights have been turned on. The cockroaches are scrambling because these things, and you mentioned this earlier, Bill, about the forms that you and I had to fill out in the federal government and state government, respectively, as we moved up in management and became, top management for me and top management for yourself, things like this. And a lot of things we were precluded from activities outside of work. We were precluded from engaging in, not because they were illegal, but sometimes just because of the appearance of impropriety, the appearance of being inappropriate, the appearance that might bring discredit to our respective agencies. And so we're at least seeing this in the federal government. And like I said, the cockroaches are now scrambling.
Yeah, I agree with that, Mark. And I remember I told you a story that, in fact, it was I did a speaking thing in Los Angeles, and you were there in attendance when you were still working with. I don't know if you were.
I think I was retired. I was now working in private sector.
In the private sector, and it was I don't know, a 1 hour speech at a lunch, and they wanted to give me like $100 honorarium or something like that, and I couldn't accept it. Yeah. And there were a lot of things, a lot of outside employment requests that people in government that get denied every single day, and yet we had someone at USAID collecting $470,000 a year. Now, I don't know. I mean, if that was put on hold, then I understand it. But when I look at the 278 form, it doesn't really make any notation like that. Mm-hmm. It appears as if she was still getting paid while working at government, and to me, that's crazy. When there's millions of dollars flowing to Harvard in different grants, or Harvard has a piece of them. And again, just like we saw with that Boston Consulting thing, it's a lot of times, or most of the time, it's not direct. Like the name is not going to be directly on it, but it's going to be someone working in consultation with them, or et cetera, et cetera. And it's like you said earlier, it's just this tangled web of layering and layering, and eventually they get a piece of it. And the light being shined on this does, I feel like, give me a little bit of an understanding of why there are this group of government people that are just anti this current administration. And so how about this, Mark? I know from my experience, if I were to have encountered something like this, and there's people right now that are upset because I'm sure they're correct when there's a lot of good things that USAID does. Right. The problem is it's very difficult right now to start filtering and saying, okay, this one's okay, this one's not. I do almost feel like everything has to be shut down, and there needs to be some complete new methodology or some completely new program developed with better checks and balances and transparency to get some of these things on track, if that's the decision that was made. What do you think about that? Do you see this as something that can be salvaged, or does it need to be, quote, blown up and kind of rebuilt from the ground up in something that doesn't even resemble what it is now?
Well, Bill, I have no problem with USAID continuing to exist as an entity. but you laid it out very well. We've gotten to the point now where the wheat and the chaff are so intertwined that you cannot pick one from the other. It's too difficult to unravel. So it has to come to a stop. It has to come to a stop and methodically gone through and getting back to its original intent. By the way, the original intent from 60 plus years ago, in a lot of ways, has faded away, and that was directly combating influence of the Soviet Union. Now we have other adversaries now. We could probably use some of the same tactics with things like that. Maybe there's a place for USAID. But what happens is, it's just like, in other words, you give your child certain privileges, and when they start getting abused, all the privileges stop until the rules are reset. And I can say that because I have a 10-year-old. Your kids are grown, but so I'm in that right now. So everything stops, and now you say, no, you have abused your privileges. In this case, you've abused your authority. The directors and other members of USAID, you have thoroughly abused them, and we have to put everything on halt, on stop right now, start from the ground up. And by the way, my guess is that this can be trimmed down to probably 10% of the current workforce over time, and can be laser focused on doing things that are ethical. And by the way, like you said, Bill, I want the things that were done with good intention and good outcome, because good intention is great, but if it's not working, you got to stop it and go ahead and redirect your resources to something's actually being effective. So if we can find a way to utilize taxpayer funds for good outcomes and good security for the United States, I'm all for that. But we cannot do it at the cost of people running an organization in a rogue method without any oversight and without any respect for the millions of Americans who pay taxes out of their hard-earned money to the federal government, and seeing it burned and used, by the way, not only just inefficiently, but inappropriately and possibly illegally.
I think you summed it up perfectly, Mark. We'll see where it goes. It's going to be interesting. What I am impressed about is working in the government. I know there's a ton of waste, fraud, and abuse, and I could tell stories about, what happens at the end of the year with money and everything else. But this is, from what I've seen, really the first time that it's been an aggressive attempt to trim things down. And it is interesting that people are upset with transparency. I really, in fact, when I looked at that, I decided to look for that 278 form this morning for Powers, and come to find out it was actually put online by the Office of Government Efficiency. So I guess that's part of the transparency. They said, hey, we're going to put these things, and it should be.
Absolutely. It's a public document.
Yeah, it's a public document, and it should absolutely be put online. Anything else, Mark, about USAID? What else, man?
Well, I do want to say this. Obviously, the pushback about the methods by which things are being exposed. I'm trying not to use any names now because we know we get censored all the time, things like that. I don't want to do that. But the president appointed somebody to put together a team to go into these agencies. And there's a lot of pushback about, well, this person has no authority. They can't do this and blah, 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 blah. I call BS on that. Now, I'm going to give one example here. I want to set the record straight so people understand. The president has the authority. He is the executive. He is the top executive. He is the only person in the executive branch. There's one person, not the vice president, not the Speaker of the House. There's one person in the executive branch, and that is the sitting president. That's it. The president has the absolute authority to see anything in the federal government. Absolutely, 100% clearance to see anything. And the president can appoint anyone as their agent to do it for them. The president obviously can't physically go through all these documents himself. The president has the authority to appoint someone to do it. They say, well, this person wasn't confirmed by the Senate. That is it's erroneous information. It's not erroneous in the fact he wasn't confirmed. It's erroneous in the fact that he has to be confirmed, or she has to be confirmed. I'll give you one example.
Mhm.
The National Security Advisor is not required to be confirmed by the Senate. That's the person's appointed by the president. That person is not a cabinet member, so they're not required to be confirmed by the Senate. But they give as much advice to the president, obviously specifically on national security issues, as anybody else in the country, but there's no confirmation requirement. Same thing is true here. The person that is leading the Department of Government Efficiency is not a government, not a cabinet member, but is appointed by the president, just like the National Security Advisor, to carry out a function to bring back information and provide advice to the president for the president to act on that advice.
Mark, do we end up seeing criminal charges here? And not about the fraud, but about what you seem to be talking about is kind of the people trying to stop the investigation, or prevent the president and his nominee, or his I don't know what you call it, his designee, I guess is a better word.
Designee, his appointee.
Yeah, his appointee, from looking at this information and from seeing this information, and judges now ruling that somehow that it can't be done. Like, I imagine if I was an agency head and I was told, no, you can't see this information in this agency. It's preposterous.
Can you imagine? Can you imagine, Bill? Can you imagine as a special agent in charge that, forget the president, just your superior flies in from DC and says, "Hey, Bill, hey, I want to see the documentation on the raid you guys did 2 months ago and blah 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 blah." And you say, "No, you can't see it."
Right.
Forget the president, just your direct supervisor. You would be lucky if you're only fired. So, your question is, it's a great one. Will we see, criminal prosecutions? I don't know. We can't tell the future. I don't have a crystal ball, but I can say this right now. It's certainly a violation of federal law that if you obstruct the president in his official duties, that is a criminal federal violation. There's no doubt about it. So it's a potential there, and especially looking at this administration with our new attorney general, oh boy, there's a lot of potential there. So people who may want to be burning documents, we don't burn anymore, of course, everything's electronic, but so to speak, I would say I would want to find myself in that position if someone comes after you from the federal government saying, "Hey, what did you do with that document?" So I will see that potential certainly there.
And one thing, Mark, from my point of view, is having worked in the U.S. government through, like 9 or 10 different administrations, I think. I am not so upset about, this might sound strange, I'm not so upset about what the money is being spent on, because I know that depending on which administration's in there, it's always going to change. And each administration has their priorities, and they want to fund things that's in line with their priorities. And it's up to the president to put someone in charge of an agency that's going to execute on what he or she wants done. But the way the money is flowing is really what disturbs me the most, right? The way the money is flowing, how it's layered, and it's just so thick with bureaucracy. The only organization which may be less efficient than a federal government might be some of these not-for-profit organizations or some of these NGOs, because they're basically establishing layers of bureaucracy just to get a cut of the contract. When there's $100 million contract to ship food to Ukraine, for example, a company in the Beltway picks up this contract, and 20 million of that comes off the top right away, and that's for their officers, for their administration fees, and everything else. So this aid has become as much as people out there are saying it's so important to people around the world what the U.S. does, the danger is, even for nonprofits, there's still salaries paid in nonprofits, Mark. Let's not get it twisted. There's still big salaries paid in nonprofits. And this U.S. aid going around the world has become a profitable business here in the United States. And that's what I take issue with. There's issues here at home that need to be addressed, And hey, if you want to do that through local governments and state governments, that's fine. But this idea of turning aid into a for-profit business, and again, we talked about the big companies, Mark. I don't know what I did with my notes here. We talked about the big companies, just to a company that's a for-profit business. Let me just name it here so I don't get it messed up. Chemonics International, 4.5 billion a year. That's a for-profit business. So they're in the business of administering U.S. aid around the world.
Mm-hmm.
There's too much administrative fees and too much of a cut being taken from that to actually do the work. And what I find more offensive than where the money is being spent, although some of that's pretty offensive to me, it's just how it's being done, and that there's profiteers or companies that, hey, if the government's buying something, I'm selling it because I know that that's a good contract to have and I can make some money on it. Anything else, Mark, to wrap it up?
No, I think it's a great way to end it, Bill, that these things are inherently inefficient, even under the best circumstances. And I think we're way beyond that with this case. But no, I think you summed it up very, very well.
Folks, look for Form 278 for any government employee at a high level. They have to disclose all their finances, where they're taking consulting fees, where they're getting honorariums for speaking, and then start looking at some of the contracts that those companies get, that, as we did today. Thanks for tuning in. We will continue to watch this one, Mark, and we'll see where it goes. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.